In this video, we're going to talk about our second economic aggregate, unemployment. And in talking about unemployment, we're really also talking about employment and jobs and the utilization of labor overall. And this is important for economists to have an understanding of. The reason it's important for economists to have an understanding of unemployment is because if unemployment is high, it can be a problem. Unemployment represents lost production. The total GDP, the total amount produced, the total output is lower when unemployment is higher. It's also for the people who are unemployed. It can be devastating. They have no income. They have no ability to support themselves and their families, so it's quite devastating to the people who are unemployed. And then lastly, the economy is worse off in the sense that when people are not working, they're not gaining knowledge and skills and experience, and so there's a loss to the human capital element. So for all of these reasons, we want to study unemployment because it helps us understand the utilization of labor as a resource and the extent to which labor is contributing to production and to growth and to the betterment of the economy overall. Now, when we're talking about unemployment, you can see that there's a number of different ways we can talk about it. So, what is the unemployment rate at a given point in time? Well, it depends on how we count. So, if we count one way, and this is the way using the official unemployment statistic U3, well, we can see that in the United States economy, for example, there's 5.7 million people who are not working, and given a population of 164, given a labor force of 164 million people, well, the unemployment rate is 3.5%. Sounds pretty low, actually, all things being considered. And so that's one way that we can calculate or count the unemployment rate. But we can use another way of calculating it, the employment to population ratio. And now the number of people not working is not just the unemployed, but also the people who are not in the labor force who are not working, and that's 106 million people. Well, in that case, the number of people who are in the population, which is a larger population because it includes a larger number of people, really all the people who could be working. Well, now the rate of people who are not working is 40.2%, which it sounds like a very big number. So we have these two different numbers. 3.5% unemployment and 40.2% of people who are in the population who are not employed. The point here is that when we talk about unemployment, there's a number of different ways that we can talk about it, and we might come to a low number or a high number depending upon the specific definition that we're using. So the unemployment statistics are determined and published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is a part of the Department of Labor, and they have got a website, the BLS.gov, which publishes all sorts of data and charts and graphs on employment, unemployment, and all of these types of things. And so if we look over time, we see unemployment going up and down. Sometimes it's lower. It's in the 2, 3, 4% range. Other times it's gone as high as 7%, 10%, and so that's higher. But in general, if we kind of normalize this line, we might find unemployment being around 5%, and that, for lots of different reasons, is the level that economists kind of use to judge unemployment, whether it's high or low. If it's above 5%, it's kind of considered higher than it should be. If it's below 5%, it's considered to be good, maybe even lower than it should be over time. And that 5% number is not based on any sort of science or any sorts of algorithm. It's just kind of more of a rule of thumb, something economists have come to accept over time. It's conventional wisdom, but it's not a scientific number. It's just really more of a rule of thumb. Um, we see times when the unemployment rate is quite high. This was following the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Unemployment reached as high as 10% and then slowly improved. It took a long time for it to get back down to this sub 5% range. Um, then in 2020, with the pandemic, with the economy shut down, it shot up to as high as 15%. And this was a little bit of a different situation. It shot up very high rapidly and then came down very rapidly. By 2022, it was back to the 3.6, 3.5% range. So we see unemployment at different times going up to very high amounts, and sometimes it recovers quickly, and other times it does not. So let's spend some time looking about how economists come to conclude these numbers. Where do they get when they say the unemployment is 5% or 4%, 3%? How do they do that? Well, they follow an algorithm or a process, which I will go through here. Now, the first thing they do is what we do is we take the total population, but we have to remove people who can't work, like babies, people under 16, people who are incarcerated. These are obviously people who can't work, so they're not really in the working age population because they're either in an institution of some sort or they're not. They're underage. So from the total population, we remove the people who are too young to work, under 16, or people who are in a jail or hospital or in some sort of other institutional care, and we arrive at the working age population. This is the total population of people who could work. Now, we then divide the working age population into two groups: people that are in the labor force and people that are not in the labor force. So the labor force includes people who are working and people who are unemployed. Now, here, unemployed is a very specific definition. You have to be unemployed and therefore in the labor force. Yes, you're not working, but you also have to be looking for work in the last 4 weeks. And so if you're someone who is not working, but you haven't been looking in the last 4 weeks, you're not considered unemployed even though you're not working. See, they use the terminology in a very specific way, and maybe a way that's different than we might talk about this topic, in everyday language. So the labor force again consists of people who are working and people who are unemployed. Unemployed meaning they're using that very specific definition. They're not working, but they've been looking actively, and they've been doing so in the last 4 weeks. So, to be counted as unemployed, you have to be making specific efforts. You have to be looking for work, and you have to have done so in the previous 4 weeks. Now, if you're not working but you're waiting to be called back from a job that you're laid off from, or if you're not working but you're going to start in the next 30 days, you're also counted in the unemployed number. You're counted as part of the labor force in those two circumstances as well. So I guess one of the points here is that when economists talk about somebody being unemployed, when they're talking about unemployment statistics, they have a very specific meaning. So you are in the working age population, you're not working, but you're actively looking to work. And you've done so in the last 4 weeks. And so here's a graphical depiction. We start on the top with the total population. We divide the total population into the working age population, all the people who can work, and the people who can't work, people who are too young, under 16, and people who are institutionalized in hospitals or prisons. The working age population gets divided into the labor force and not in the labor force. And the labor force, of course, includes both the employed and unemployed. And so one of the things you'll notice is that some of the people who are in the working age population are not in the labor force. And yet there are people who could be working and are not working. So again, this is when we talk about people being unemployed. Those are only the people who aren't working who happen to be in the labor force. That's because they're not working and they've looked for work in the last 4 weeks. So we use that very specific definition. Now we can look at the employment data from 2022 and see how this looks for the United States. So the total population is 332 million people. 68 million of those 332 are either under 16 or institutionalized, leaving us with a working age population of 264 million. Now, of the 264 million in the working age population, the labor force consists of 164 million people, the 158 million people who are working, and the 5.7 million people who are not working but have looked in the last 4 weeks. So when we talk about the unemployment rate is 3.5%. That's the 5.7 million people who are not working divided by the 164 million people in the labor force. You'll notice that there's a very large number of people who are not in the labor force. Now, some of those people may not be in the labor force for good reason. Maybe they are senior citizens, they've retired, and so they're not really actively looking for work. They don't really want to work. Or maybe it's also somebody who's independently wealthy, a man of leisure. So there's lots of reasons why you might be not in the labor force. But some of those people are also people who, would work, want to work, could work, but they're just, if you haven't looked in the last 4 weeks, you're not counted. And so you're not in the labor force at all. And so you drop out of the system, in a sense, when it comes to calculating the unemployment statistics. So what we just talked about, this unemployment number here, the 3.5%, that's the standard unemployment calculation that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses. It's called U3, unemployment 3, by the way. But there are other ones that we can calculate the unemployment rate. We can also calculate the employment to population ratio. How many people are employed in the total population, or in the working age population, rather? We can also look at the labor force participation rate. How many people in the working age population are in the labor force? So we have a number of different ways that we can look at labor utilization. We can look at employment and unemployment. It's not just the unemployment rate that we have. So if we look at the unemployment rate, you can see how it's calculated here. We take the number of people who are unemployed. They're not working. They're in the labor force. And they've looked in the last 4 weeks, divided by the labor force. So this is the 5.7 million people who are not working and are looking, divided by the 163 million people in the labor force, and we come up with 3.5%. This is the standard definition of unemployment. When you hear in the news that the unemployment is 3.5% or 4.3% or 5.7%, this is the calculation they're talking about, this U3 calculation, which is defined in this very particular way. This is the standard definition of unemployment known as U3. And this unemployment rate will increase during a recession when the economy is not growing. Companies will hire less, they'll lay people off, they'll do things like that. And so unemployment is higher when we're in a recession. And then it is the lowest when the economy starts growing, or when the economy is in growth mode. Here's the U3 rate over the last 70 years, and again you can see it goes up and down over time. It's been as high as 7% and 10% and 12% and even higher. It's been as low as in the low 2%, 2-3% range. So on average, again, if we drew this line, it's probably in this 5% range. Sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. And we can see that unemployment increases during recession when the economy is not growing. When we're in a downturn, businesses don't hire people. In fact, they oftentimes lay people off. And so we have higher unemployment during recession, and we have less unemployment during periods of economic growth. Now, the second metric we can use is the employment to population ratio. And here we divide the number of people who are employed not by the labor force but by the working age population. This is how many of all the people who could be working, how many are actually employed. And so in this case, we take the 158 million people who are working divided by the total number of people who could be working, which is 264 million, and we come out with a employment to population ratio of 59.84%. This means that 59.84% of the people in the working age population are employed, and 40.16% of the people in the working age population are not employed. And you can see this is a much broader view of employment and unemployment. 60% of the people who could be working, roughly 60% of the people who could be working, are working, and 40% of the people who could be working are not working. Creates a very different view than U3, which uses the labor force as the denominator and therefore comes up with a much smaller number for the people who are not working than the employment to population ratio. And then we can also look at the labor force participation rate. How many people in the working age population are in the labor force, either as people who are working or people unemployed, with a more narrow definition? And this comes up with a kind of a similar number. You can see the labor force participation is 62%. That means that of the working age population, 62% of them are in the labor force. And so as economists, we use all three of these metrics to try to understand employment and unemployment. And some of them are more narrow, some of them are broader. And this way, if we use all of these metrics, we can kind of get a better view of what unemployment looks like. Recently unemployment's been very low in the 3.5, 4% range, and economists are saying, wow, unemployment's low. But when you look at the broader measures, like the employment, the labor force participation rate, and the employment to population ratio, those aren't changing as much. Those broader measures are not showing the same positive picture that the U3 unemployment rate shows, or it doesn't show something as positive, I guess is a better way to say it. And so here we can see the labor force participation over time. Back in the 1950s and 60s, it was below 60. It went up for a bit in the 70s, in the 80s, and kind of leveled off. And more recently, it went up into the high 60s, and now it's kind of in the low 60s, which is where it's kind of been settled. So we do see a big change between the 1950s and 60s, and then we have a higher labor force participation in the 1970s. More people in the working age population were working rather, and that goes up and down over time. And so we have these three definitions, or these three ways of looking at employment and unemployment. Now remember, the point of all of this is to try to understand the utilization or the underutilization of labor resources. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics, people at the Federal Reserve, etc., think that the U3 definition of unemployment, right, gives the correct measure. But the U3 measure excludes a number of people, and especially the two most significant are the marginally attached workers and part-time workers who want full-time jobs. U3 would count them as not in the labor force or as being employed, and maybe we'll show a picture that's more positive than it actually is. So we have marginally attached workers. A marginally attached worker is someone who's not working, and they've looked for a job in the past, but not in the last 4 weeks. So these are people that are in the working age population who want to work, but wouldn't be considered part of the labor force. And some of these marginally attached workers are called discouraged workers. They've stopped looking altogether because they've looked for a long period of time, maybe a year or 2 years, and they can't find a job. So the point here is that these marginally attached and discouraged workers want to work, but they're not in the labor force based on the more narrow, specific definition of who's supposed to be in the labor force. So they don't show up in U3, but they do show up in the broader measures like the labor force participation rate. Similarly, with regards to U3, there are some workers, U3 counts all the workers, whether you're working full time or part time, as employed. Uh, but there are some part time workers who want to work full time, but they can't find full time work. And so U3 will count them as employed, but maybe they're not as utilized. Maybe their labor is not utilized as it could be. And so this is another um, issue with the U3 definition of unemployment. Part-time workers who want to work more are counted as employed, and their underutilization is not captured in the U3 measurement. And so what the BLS does is we have this official U3 measurement. That's the one that we use the most. But we have actually 6 measurements. We have U1 through U6. U1 and 2 are more narrow measures. They try to focus in on specific types of unemployed people. U3 is the standard measurement of unemployment that we talked about. And then we have broader measures of unemployment, like U4, which adds discouraged workers who are really the long-term unemployed but haven't looked in the last 4 weeks. We have the other marginally attached workers. There may be have looked more recently, but not the last 4 weeks. And then part-time workers are picked up in U6. So we have these. We have really 9 measurements of labor utilization. We have U1 through U6, and then the labor force participation and the employment to population ratio. That would give us 8 measures, rather. So we have plenty of measures, plenty of ways for economists to look at employment and unemployment, and they can look at different aspects of it by having more ways to look at it than just looking at U3. And so here you can see U1 through 6 charted for the last 30 years or so, and you can see U6 on the top, U3 is green in the middle, and you have the more narrow measures on the bottom, the more broad measures on the top, and they generally go together. And the unemployment, tends to increase during periods of recession, which are in these blue bands, but they also move at different times. So we have all of these different measurements that we can look at for employment and unemployment, and it gives us a fuller picture of labor utilization and the extent to which labor resources are underutilized. Now, we can also look at the sources of unemployment, and economists do look at the different sources. So when somebody's unemployed, there's 3 ways that we can categorize why they're unemployed. So they can be unemployed for frictional reasons, for structural reasons, or for cyclical reasons, and we'll look at each one of the 3. Frictional unemployment is the unemployment that arises from the normal labor market turnover. Some workers are moving from one city to another. Maybe they're retraining themselves, taking on a new profession, and they may be out of work for a small period of time while they're going about doing all these changes. Change is a normal part of life. Sometimes you're going to be moving from one job to another job as you're changing, and this unemployment is considered frictional unemployment. It's actually considered good because we wouldn't want a world where people couldn't move from one place to another or couldn't change their careers or their jobs. And so this frictional unemployment is considered part of the normal labor market turnover. Next, we have structural unemployment. Structural unemployment is unemployment that's created when there's changes to technology or foreign competition that completely change the skills that are needed to perform jobs in specific locations. We know that a lot of manufacturing has gone from certain parts of the United States to other parts or to overseas, and so the unemployment that's associated with this is called structural unemployment. This is actually also considered okay from an economic standpoint because it's being done, I guess, for economic reasons or for good economic reasons. The last type of unemployment is cyclical unemployment. This is the unemployment that's associated with the ups and downs of the business cycle, with recessions. And so when a worker is laid off because the economy is in a recession, then this is considered cyclical unemployment. They'll eventually be rehired, maybe when the economy grows again. But for right now, they're unemployed because we're in a recession. And so, of the three, this is considered the bad type of unemployment. This is the unemployment that's associated with economic downturns, and this is cyclical unemployment. So these are important because economists will talk about natural unemployment as being the unemployment that happens when all the unemployment in the economy results only from frictional and structural unemployment, when there's no cyclical unemployment. Remember, economists kind of consider frictional and structural unemployment as either good or okay because they're unemployment that happens for like sound economic reasons. And cyclical unemployment is the bad unemployment. It's the unemployment that happens because of recessions or economic downturns, and that's so. We say that the natural unemployment comes from frictional and structural unemployment, and if we have unemployment only for those reasons and no cyclical unemployment, then we're at full employment. That doesn't mean there's zero unemployment. It just means that the unemployment that exists only exists because of the types of unemployment we consider to be good or okay, frictional and structural unemployment. So when the economy is at full employment, there will be no cyclical unemployment. All the unemployment that exists only exists because of frictional or structural reasons. So you see, we have this. We use the sources of unemployment to try to understand the natural rate of unemployment when there's no cyclical unemployment. And when we have no cyclical unemployment, we say we're at full employment, that the labor resources are fully utilized. Now, the natural rate of unemployment or full unemployment rate can vary over time. I said earlier that conventional wisdom amongst economists, they use this 5% number. This is not based on any sort of formula or science. It's really more of a rule of thumb. When it's 5% or lower, we say we're either at or below full employment, and when it's 5% or higher, we say it's then we are not at the full employment. Now, mind you, according to our technical definition, if we had frictional unemployment of 5% and structural unemployment of 5%, then we'd have total unemployment of 10%, and that would be full employment. So this 5% number really is just a rule of thumb thing, and it kind of adds a little confusion to things at times. The reason I bring it up here is you may hear economists talk about 5% as being full employment. Where does it come from? It's just conventional wisdom. The technical definition of full employment is when the only unemployment that exists is because of frictional and structural reasons, and when there's zero cyclical unemployment. Now, we can use this idea further and talk about unemployment and how it relates to GDP and potential GDP. We say that if the real GDP exists is the GDP that's produced when we're at full employment, yes, we have frictional unemployment, yes, we have structural unemployment, but we have no cyclical unemployment, then the real GDP is equal to potential GDP. The economy is producing at its greatest amount because there's no cyclical unemployment. When there's no cyclical unemployment, then the real GDP is equal to potential GDP. When the real GDP being produced is less than the potential GDP, that means that there's some cyclical unemployment, and we're not producing the full employment amount of output. We say there's an output gap. This happens when unemployment is higher than the full employment rate. And over the business cycle, this output gap may fluctuate from time to time. And you can see here on the chart, the red line is the real potential GDP. The blue line is the real GDP. So there's times when the real GDP is below the real potential GDP, that means we have an unemployment rate that's greater than the full unemployment rate, that's greater than the natural unemployment rate. And the way that we interpret this is the economy is not using all of its labor resources fully. It's not producing an output that's associated with full employment. It's producing something less than that, and we call that the output gap. And you will notice there are times when counterintuitively, the real GDP can be beyond the real potential GDP. That's cases when the unemployment rate is below the full employment unemployment rate, and in that case, we think that's not sustainable. The economy's producing beyond what it can do on a sustainable basis based on full employment. And so, in this way, we can see that the unemployment helps us understand not only how labor resources are being utilized, but also how employment and unemployment is connected and contributing to production and output and economic growth.